Okay, we are back with Mike Donahue, the chess coordinator for the Chris Collinsworth Pro Scan Fund Chess and School Program, and Russell Wilson, National Master and board member on the Chris Collinsworth Pro Scan Fund. And we're going to be taking a look at one, probably the decisive game of the match of the century, as it's been called, between Bobby Fischer and Boris Spassky, 1972, Game 6, played on July 23rd. And it's a really not just a dynamic game, but also a really historically significant game. And Russell, tell us a little bit about what your interest in this game is and why you picked this game to be one of the ones we give some analysis to.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think this is probably, if I had to pick the most famous game ever played in chess, particularly if you consider non-tournament players, this probably is it. There was more attention paid to the Fischer-Spassky match in 1972 than any other chess match in my lifetime, certainly. This was covered on the national news, on all the major networks. It was covered on all the major magazines. Almost all newspapers would report on the results of the individual games and include the scores of the game. So it received an amount of attention that no other chess match or game had ever picked up before, far more than the game we just looked at. Prior to the match, Fischer and Spassky had played 5 times, and Spassky had won 3 of the 5 and drawn the other 2. So Spassky was supported by the entire Soviet Union chess apparatus. We now know that every top player was ordered to provide him with detailed analysis of Fischer and his weaknesses and recommendations on how Spassky might defeat him. And he had really all the resources that the Soviet Union could offer to support him, while Fischer was pretty much operating by himself. But to also put this game into other contexts, at the time when the beginning of the match, the match was 24 games in length. The way the match begins, Spassky wins the first 2 games. And that's a huge advantage to start off the match, because if the match ends 12-12 tie, Spassky keeps his title. Fischer had to win 12.5, 11.5 to win. So in effect, he's down 3 games already. Fischer wins game 3, draws game 4, and wins game 5 to even the match when this game is played. But to put another wrinkle to it, Fischer was known throughout his career for always opening with his pawn to e4. And really, this is when you look at this game, it's got best by protest. That's a pun, because Fischer said that pawn to e4 was best by test. And that was his famous quote in that. And virtually every single game he had played up to this point was pawn to e4. But in a 24 game match where he would have to play 12 games as white, it would be hard for him to come up with something new and original off of e4 every time. And so it wasn't a total surprise, but it was a surprise that he begins this game with the pawns to c4.
And and Fischer had never really played c4, in any of the candidate, matches. This was a very novel, kind of uncharacteristic move.
Novel for him, but this is a very popular move at the highest level, but not something he had ever played. He might have played it once or twice out of, say, 400 or 500 games where he had the white pieces. So very shocking, although it's pretty clear Spassky was working to be ready for this possibility, just because, like I said before, it would be hard for someone to develop a match strategy revolving only around one move as a first move. And I'm sure that's what Fischer eventually realized, and he then went looking for opportunities to surprise and beat Spassky after other moves.
Can we, before we jump into the game, I'm really eager to take a look at it. But want to just highlight some of the geopolitical context in which this match was
Sure.
played. It's kind of at the height of the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States, and the Soviet players had really been dominant in the mid 20th century. We talked in the previous video about kind of the Soviet system of chess, and world champion after world champion, was coming from the Soviet Union. They were producing the vast majority of the top players, and here's Bobby Fischer, this kid from Brooklyn who was turning a lot of heads, and had become kind of the sole rising star in the United States. And as you mentioned, Russell, he largely prepared in solitude. He didn't have a whole lot of the supports that Spassky had, in the Soviet Union. And, it was very much, this match was very much a reflection of these two superpowers in the wake of World War II kind of facing off, and there was a lot of symbolism that was associated with it. Fischer, was kind of holding out at the beginning of the match, and was trying to negotiate a higher prize fund and so on, and threatened to not participate in it. And if the story that goes as the way I've heard it is that even Henry Kissinger, the Secretary of State, calls him up. He was at I don't know if it was a New York airport, maybe LaGuardia, calls him up and says, be a patriot. We need you. You've got to do this for your country.
Yeah.
And persuaded him, among Kissinger, among others, persuaded Fischer to continue to play and go to Iceland to play the game. Any other reflections on kind of the historical context of the match?
No, you're right. I mean, the match was seemed to be in jeopardy. I mean, Fischer was not happy that they had the World Chess Federation had selected Iceland for the match, because a different city in what was then Yugoslavia, Belgrade, had offered more money, and he wanted the more money. And then he and he was trying to negotiate for more money. I don't think political part was meant that much to him at that point anyway. And then a British chess fan, very wealthy man, doubled the prize fund and said, okay, if you're holding back because there's not enough money, I'm going to double the prize fund and call your bluff. And that, and Kissinger and all the other people encouraging him to play, he finally does get on a plane and goes to Iceland. But it was
loses the first game, forfeits the second game. He had concerns about the TV cameras making noise and proximity to the board. So it was a very dramatic, given the backdrop of the Cold War, and then Fischer's own kind of negotiations. There were controversies involved, and he certainly comes back over the course of the match, and this game 6 here was a decisive moment.
So the way the match ends up finishing is he wins this game 6 to take a 1-point lead. They draw game 7, Fischer wins game 8, they draw game 9, Fischer wins game 10. So now Fischer has a 3-point lead. They would later, Fischer would lose game 11, but win game 13, restoring his 3-point lead. And then it was only till the last game of the match, game 21, that another decisive result. They were all draws. And when Fischer won game 21, he clinched the title at that time. So, but this was really, when you consider the fact that he was down 2-0 over the course between games 3, so by winning game 3, 5, 6, 8, and 10, he completely turns the thing around from being down decisively to being up decisively. And while it would have been possible for Spassky to regain the lead, he was unable to do that. So,
and he starts off with a very uncharacteristic opening. Fischer here with the white pieces, Spassky with black, and plays c4. And that must have been, the first of a series of surprises. What happens then?
So, and what really makes this to a chess a player that had been following Spassky's career, Spassky ends up playing an opening that he had used many, many times as black and had never, ever lost a game. He'd drawn many, but he had never lost with this system that he uses. So, and that's a natural reaction if you're a player where you're surprised, you're going to go to what you feel comfortable with, where you've had a lot of success. If nothing else, he'd lost 2 out of the previous 3 games, sort of regain his equilibrium by drawing this game. So Spassky's not going to take any kind of chances like we saw Bopanik take out of a similar structure. But at the same time, Fischer clearly knew there was a high probability he would resort to this system, because we're transposing after c4 into a position from the Queen's Gambit, very similar formation to what we saw before, but now we'll see that there are very different ways you can play what look to be similar structures. So they're very focused on getting their pieces developed to prepare for castling. And you'll see, so the first, not in the exact same order, but the first 5 moves that White played are the same first 5 moves that we saw in the Bopanik game.
Yeah, very similar. And so we've got Fischer here playing a Queen's Gambit like Denker did previously. And, Spassky not quite playing a semi-Slav here to do that. Bopanik was played pawn to c6. We don't see that.
Bopanik played pawn to c6 and didn't put his bishop on e7. But the bishop on e7, we looked before, we saw the pin aspect. The bishop on e7 blocks the pin, breaks the pin, I should say. Certainly reduces its severity considerably. But this is a much more solid approach that Black is adopting in this game. But again, he was known to favor this system in his tournament play against super strong players. So he castles kingside. Again, the other game it was queenside. This is kingside is a more normal place in a Queen's Gambit decline as Black where you would castle. White continues his development. He also now wants to be able to, if Black were to capture the pawn on c4, he could recapture it very conveniently with his bishop. This is an important move, which prepares to break the pin further if necessary. The bishop goes back. And this move here, b6 in conjunction with h6 is what they call the Tartakower defense. And this is the system that Spassky had used so many times with so much success. It's still very much used today, although the specific line that we see here is not popular any longer. So Fischer uses the popular. Again, because he's studied Spassky's games, he knows what Spassky's likely to do, and he's got an idea he wants to try out on Spassky, and that's really what happens in this game. So he captures here first. Black is captures with the knight because he wants to get some pieces exchanged off the board, which he thinks will ease his defense, and it does. So the bishop, Fischer captures the bishop on e7, then captures the knight on d5. And so now you see black, his bishop has got a variety of places it can go. The knight will come out. He's already castled. His queen's on a reasonable square. So these are the kind of things that Spassky finds attractive in playing this line. He also knew that
that's a lot of exchange, right off of the bat there. I mean, one of the things that sticks out to me, the advantage of the Tartakower defense of pushing that pawn on b6 is that it precludes the pawn on c4 from advancing further to c5. And so, I wonder if Fischer's decision to take, on d5 there, was motivated in part by that pawn on b6, but that was the beginning of, wow, there's a lot happened right there.
Yeah, so and this is part of what makes it attractive to black, is that he gets easy development and he's exchanged some pieces, and so I'm sure Spassky was very comfortable here. The pawn on b6 allows the black bishop to be developed either in this direction or in this direction, but it also supports the idea of his playing his pawn to c5, which is what we'll see what happens in the game. But as far as Fischer's concerned, I think Fischer had the position that we're about to see in a few moves on the chessboard in his den, and had trying to come up with ways to create problems for Spassky that he might not be able to solve with the cameras on and the pressure of the match. So he plays this move, which works to try to create pressure along this file. The bishop goes here, not here, because the bishop is really more actively placed here. It protects the pawn on d5. And if it's on b7, it can be sometimes attacked by white, particularly if, say, his queen went here. Fischer brings his queen out, and now Spassky plays the idea that which is to play his pawn to c5, and Fischer now moves his queen back to pin the pawn. So the pawn can't capture on d4 or move to c4 without losing the queen on e7. And meantime, white is threatening to capture that, so Spassky protects it by moving his rook to c8. Again, this was what he would have been known to play by Fischer, and this is where Fischer plays a very unusual move, a rare move, and this was undoubtedly the surprise he cooked up for Spassky in this variation. He plays his bishop to b5. Now, as it turns out, it's really not that good of a move, but this sort of illustrates kind of what modern chess at the highest level is about, which is trying to create fresh problems at the board for your opponent, and if they make a mistake, then try to capitalize on them. And that's kind of what happens in this game.
Can we just pause there? I mean,
Sure.
So we've got pressure kind of building up on c5. We've got queens and rooks kind of protecting and attacking that pawn on c5. And yeah, the bishop to b5. What does that look like? What does that look like to you, Mike? Is there any opportunities there, or is that can you see logic behind that?
Well, it definitely develops the bishop, and it looks kind of like an odd square for the bishop. Obviously, my chess playing ability is nowhere near Bobby Fischer's, but it looks kind of odd to me aesthetically.
I mean, the obvious things is, okay, he's wanting to castle, and so he's wanting to develop the bishop, as you mentioned. The other options are D3, you could come all the way over to A6 and hit the rook, maybe. Although you wouldn't want to do that because of the knight and B8. So, yeah.
I think if this game if he was going to move the bishop but not to B5, he probably would have placed it on E2. Because if you put it on A6, then black would probably just capture it with the knight. And then after the queen captures back, he probably would have pushed the pawn to C4. Because black's strategy here, if he gets his pawn to C4, is to try to move his queenside pawns forward and try to create an attack that way. And if you put it on D3, eventually with C4, black gains a tempo, a move, because the bishop on D3 would be attacked and would have to move. So I think the alternative really was to move it to this square.
That makes sense.
But the logic behind it is that he's trying to keep black from developing his knight, because if it immediately goes, if you look at what its options are, really, if it goes to C6, he can capture the pawn on C5. And if it goes to D7, he can capture that then. And then if the queen recaptures, then he can capture the pawn on C5. So he would have to move the bishop, recapture it with the bishop, which might be awkward after white, say, castles kingside. So that was really, I think, the subtle point of it was that he's calling the question about how is black going to get this knight to the square it wants to go to, which is D7, without being captured. So what Spassky played was this move bishop to B5 had hardly ever been seen before, but in the past, when it had been played, the black players had been playing pawn to A6 with some success. But Fischer had must have expected this response, because it was what they would call a chess book. And he has some improvements in mind. The first thing he does is he castles. He captures on C5 first. Black recaptures with the pawn. If he had recaptured with a piece, eventually this knight would be sitting on D4 and be looking very, very comfortable there. So he recaptures with the pawn, and then he castles, taking advantage of the fact that if he plays pawn takes bishop, queen captures the rook on A8. So taking advantage of that pin. Black still doesn't want to bring the knight to D7, so he plays his rook here, which now the pawn on A6 is free to capture on B5 because the queen protects it laterally. The rook also protects the queen, so in theory the pawn could be pushed to C4 without white winning a queen for nothing on E7. So Fischer's forced to retreat his bishop to E2. Again, not looking like a world-beating square. And so Spassky continues with the development that he wanted all along, the knight to D7. And then Fischer plays another deep move, knight to D4, taking advantage of the fact, again, as before, pawn takes knight, the queen would capture the queen on E7.
I mean, I like how Spassky's playing here. I mean, I think that this knight to D4 is a really, really interesting move. But, with Spassky kind of bringing his rook up to A7 and finally being able to develop that knight, Fischer's backing his bishop back to E2. I think that in the last 4 or 5 moves here, Spassky's, looking pretty strong.
Yeah, it's hard to criticize some of his moves. His position's a little loose in that, as you look at his position, both rooks and his queen are unprotected. Okay, if you look at white's position, all of his pieces are protected by another one. So he's got a little bit of looseness, but his pieces are out. They're all reasonably placed. And in a move or two, he'll be able to reconnect all the dots and be in great shape. But Fischer saw that and wants to take advantage now. So he's taking advantage of the fact that all these pieces are loose, a little bit loose, which gives him some tactical opportunities. And so the move Spassky plays is a natural move. He plays his queen back to f8. And so now with the queen on f8, it's protected, so he could capture this knight on the next move. So he's forcing Fischer's hand here by doing that. And this is really where, Fischer comes into his own, and he shows what his true idea was all along. And believe me, I'm sure this, although he was never interviewed after the match, I'm sure this position was on the board, his board at home, as he prepared for the match. He captures the bishop on e6, and the only way to get it back is to capture with the pawns. And now he shows really the next move. He plays his pawn to e4, which softens up this pawn mass of blacks in the center. If he were to capture here, these three pawns and this one too, are all isolated, and they're all weak and have to be defended, and eventually Fischer would get one or more of them. And Spassky doesn't like the idea of Fischer capturing here, because then the bishop could come here, and then this is all very awkward. So he pushes this pawn. But this is kind of plays into what Fischer had in mind also, because now this bishop takes a very, will eventually take a very dominant square. The first thing he does is he starts advancing his pawns, because he's going to, what we're about to find out, while before, during the game, all of Fischer's activity seemed to be focused over here, his goal all along was to attack the king on the other side of the board. And the next few moves sort of focus in on that.
I mean, one of the questions, can you back up like 4 or 5 moves before the knight takes the bishop, I think, on e6? Yeah. I mean, my thought here was bishop takes on a pawn on a6, rook takes, queen takes. That's a nice exchange for white. What's wrong with that?
If I were to play this now, I guess that would be in this position. If you were to take that now, black would play the rook here, this on c8 to a8, okay. And now this bishop is lost because he can't move it without giving up his queen for a rook.
Got it.
So he can't do that. So this pawn is weak, but you can't capture it safely.
Yeah. Okay.
But
you were saying though that the longer term strategy, even though it looks like he's building up pressure on queen side, that eventually there's going to be a swing to the other side of the board.
Correct. And he's going to take advantage of the fact that his bishop, because it can move long distances, is able to affect both sides of the board and swing back and forth very quickly. But it's remarkable how all these ideas sort of come together in a few moves. And the other thing about this pawn on a6 is, chess has a saying, sometimes the threat is greater than its execution. In other words, you get more out of threatening it than you would by taking it. It ties down this rook on a7. It's not really maybe as actively placed as it would want to be. Rooks like to be on files that are open. And here it's sort of hunkered down, playing only a very limited defensive role.
Mm-hmm.
But again, sort of the depth and beauty of Fischer's idea, it's really only revealed after these next few moves. This is where I think we were before. If you would, as we will see, some of these, as the game develops, for example, now the bishop will end up on a beautiful square here, and now the queen, which could never have dreamed of going to the king side in one move, because these pawns that move forward can now do that, and we'll do that in a couple of moves. This move is important because it keeps the knight off of this square and also helps freeze the pawn on e6, because Fischer plans on attacking it. Spassky now brings his queen there. I think he brings his queen there now. One, he wants to protect the pawn with his king, but he's also creating a square for his knight to go here, f8. Now Fischer locks in the position, locks the pawn in on e6. One of the things about chess is that if you have a weakness, you want to fix it, and so he's fixing the weakness on e6. Spassky moves his rook to a more active square. Fischer moves his bishop to its most active square. So now it's attacking this pawn, but it's also, this pawn is pinned because the king is behind it. So he's, to some degree, has ideas of pushing the pawn to f5. So Spassky avoids that by moving his king off the same diagonal. And now Fischer swings his queen over, because he realizes that if black plays rook capturing this pawn, he has bishop capturing this one, which will give him wide open lines on the king, and these two pawns will be able to move forward. So Spassky can't allow him to do that, so he drops the knight back to f8 like we had discussed, or as I'd mentioned before. And now, by Fischer playing his pawn to b3, he protects it. So this rook capture is no longer on the table. It also supports the bishop in its beautiful square on c4. Spassky plays this. Remember, we were talking a few minutes ago about the fact that he had a rook tied down to capture, to defending this pawn. Now he frees himself of that obligation. He also might later push it further. But Fischer now starts playing very actively and plays his pawn to f5. He realizes he can't win that pawn by force. And just like in the Botvinnik game, Botvinnik used white's pawn on d4 as sort of a fulcrum to create activity for his pieces. Fischer does the same thing with the pawn on e6. Spassky is forced to recapture, and he captures back with his rook. He's going to activate his rooks. And so now the rook is potentially could go to this square on f7. So Spassky has to watch for that from now on. He plays his knight there to try to bring it to a defensive role, more active defensive role, and Fischer plays there. Spassky retreats his queen to try to get allow this rook to come over to help out. And now Fischer he protects this pawn, but he's also beginning to pay attention to this square. He also is opening up his pawn. He sees that Spassky eventually might play his knight here, and he wants to stop that. So, Spassky brings his rook over. He now plays his pawn to h4 again, primarily to keep a black knight off of g5. A lot of what's now this is a committal move, but it now completely owns this square. The pawn is like a bone in Spassky's throat because it controls these two key squares in his position. Plus, it's only 2 squares away from queening. So black has to be very careful there. Now, a lot of the moves Spassky's going to make now are going to be marking time because he really doesn't have much he can do. And Fischer slowly builds his position, puts his queen on a very active square in the center of the board. It's attacking this pawn, it's attacking this pawn, and then covering this square. And again, similar idea. He's playing this pawn to block this pawn, so he's just squeezing black's more and more. Black is just sort of biding time, and Fischer is sort of trying to figure out the exact perfect position for his pieces before he tries the final assault. And so now by switching the bishop to this square, he's now going to try to start to develop some threats. And we'll see how those work out. But it's a very powerful ending to the game. He plays here, and now Fischer plays this. And you think, oh, well, this pawn's hanging. But if the rook were to capture this pawn, white would play rook to f8 check, okay? And then if the queen captures, then the queen would take the knight checkmate. If the knight captures, he would play this rook and capture the knight with check, and then play his queen to h7 checkmate after that. So this pawn can't be touched by black. And now he plays here. That same threat exists even if he doesn't take the pawn. So he tries to block it by bringing his knight out. Of course, if he brought the knight to f8, Fischer would just capture it. If Fischer's ready, he knows exactly how he wants to proceed here. And he, I'm sure, has seen the game conclude in checkmate. He captures the rook. Now, this is a sacrifice of an exchange, although, because generally a rook is worth more than a knight. But like I said before, he's already calculated it out to the end. Spassky recaptures with his pawn. Fischer captures it back, which adds a number of dimensions. One is that it helps protect this pawn now, but it also is going to be very useful to attack for the attack. For instance, this threatening rook takes on h6. He moves the king out of the way. Fischer now brings his bishop back on this diagonal. Now the rook can't move without him pushing the pawn to e7, which would result in a discovered check. And again, Spassky has nothing he can really do. And then Fischer now plays here. And now here Spassky resigns because he sees that checkmate is unavoidable. So for example, let's say he moved his rook here. He doesn't really have a whole lot of options. I'm sorry. He also is threatening his rook, rook to f8 check, which would win the queen. So he has to stop that as well. Really the only way to do that would be to play his king to g8. But then after queen takes pawn, it's going to be not too difficult for him to come up with a checkmate. Again, because once the king's on g8, if the rook were to move over, the pawn goes to e7, and the bishop then is checking him. So here Spassky resigned. And then the book points out that after he resigned the game, the crowd went nuts. There's a standing ovation, and Spassky stands up and applauds the game. Now, the book says, attributes this to somehow Spassky giving up, but that's really, it was really, he was being a sportsman. Here, again, as I said before, this was a system he'd never lost with. Fischer had never played against it as white. And here Fischer comes up playing a brilliant game to beat him in that line. And Spassky was one of the toughest match players really in chess history. And he'd beaten, in the previous few years, he'd played 8 matches and won 7 of them against the top players in the world. And again, just a huge victory for Fischer, both as a level of the quality of the game, but also the circumstances of the game.
Yeah, that last sequence was really elegant. I mean, it was a really interesting, prior to that, there was like, you characterized Spassky to having a series of waiting moves and, really seemed like very minor, positional moves, even for Fischer, but to see how it kind of unfolds in this, like it did, and just the board control. I mean, I think that's the that whole king side black, the whole quadrant there, is under significant control by the white pieces. It's very impressive.
Yeah, and so again, it's really one of I think you measure most games with really 2 standards. One is the sporting significance, and the other one is the quality of the game. And for the quality of the game, you typically need to be playing a really good player who doesn't make doesn't make a stupid mistake. And sort of this fits into both. The sporting significance was, it's a world championship match that's tied. And then the sporting, then the quality of it is, it's just really an impeccable game and brilliantly played, both from the concept that he identified, but also his tactics of realizing his advantage. And Fischer, Spassky made waiting moves because he had nothing. There was nothing else he could do. He just had to wait for Fischer to see whether Fischer could figure out a way to break in, and he did. So, in spectacular fashion.
Yeah, it's amazing. There's, I think, certainly there's photographs, but there might even be video of Spassky standing up at the end and applauding, and a real significant moment. Certainly in hindsight, Fischer being the first American to win a world champion chess title, and first and only up until this point at least. And so welcome to the Bobby Fischer boom in chess. And like we were talking earlier, largely responsible for the popularity and increased attention that the game received in the United States since then.
Yeah, it's I know, myself included, and many other like me, we probably would never have played tournament chess. And then when you consider the fact that if we had never played tournament chess, we wouldn't be involved with things like the Chris Collinsworth Proscan Fund and the Queen City Classic. The ripple effects are really hard to huge changes to the world, to the U.S. chess, because of Fischer and what he did almost 50 years ago.
In this game in particular, in this even the last sequence of moves here being a real crystallization.
And I should say, in Fischer, he played other games in this match that were also extremely had high quality responses. For any chess fan, going through all of them, it could be amazing. Just how hard he fought and how inventive he was, but just really a lot of beautiful games in this match for both players. Both Spassky his wins as well. But this, I think, is probably the most famous because it broke. He was playing pawn to something other than pawn to e4 on his first move, and second of all, the match was tied up when he wins the game. And it clearly set the tone for the rest of the match. So,
yeah, Russell, I had a quick question for you. It seems like in this game and the previous game with Botnovic, the side that won definitely deviated from the normal kind of chess principles that we learn. In the last game, it seemed like open lines kind of was superior to maybe Botnovic not having quite as safe as a king. And in this game, Fischer allowed that series of trades in the beginning. And I know that I tell my students, beginner players that, don't trade pieces unless you have a clear idea. So it seems like the winners both kind of deviated from that, which maybe in a way is frustrating because we can't rely on, these dogmatic principles to play chess. But it also seems kind of neat that having a creative plan and looking at concrete moves can be more powerful than using those chess principles. Is there a general balance of what a beginning player can do to try to navigate?
What I would say is, in the Botnovic game, we saw there were clearly some chess principles that were being violated. I think the one that you talked about here about exchanging pieces, I think Fischer would probably say that his idea all along was that he thought he could get to a formation where his bishop was demonstrably better than Black's knight. And so when you say people don't exchange pieces unless you have a reason for it, to a top level player, exchanging pieces so you end up in a situation where you have a really good one and your opponent has a really bad one, that's the reason. Now, again, that's a very subtle thing that's going to take some time and experience to learn. what the differences are and when it's good and when it's bad. But I think that's, to me, this is less revolutionary in that sense. Because as we saw in the game, this White's bishop, and Fischer was known very much for preferring bishops to knights. Some of his most remarkable games involve his ability to use a bishop in a uniquely skilled way. This bishop was just a monster. Didn't look right now. It doesn't look like much, but even when you look into why Spassky resigned, a lot of it is because this pawn could move to e7 with a check if the king was here. And the knight that Spassky had wasn't really doing much of anything for so long. So that's sort of the nuance there, Mike. On you don't trade pieces unless you have a reason, but if you end up with the better pieces, then that at the highest level anyway, that's quite frankly, that's what top players do and how they win their games is by getting their pieces to be better than their opponents and then making that difference count. So
and generally, what makes a bishop or a knight more powerful than the other? Is there any, basic way to explain what makes a good bishop versus a bad bishop?
Yeah. So as far as in this game, we saw that that Fischer's bishop had a lot of potential moves it could make, and it could participate both on the queen side and on the king side. While a knight, because it has fewer things to move, it can only move much shorter distances, has a harder time influencing a board on both sides. Now, I think if what normally makes a bishop not so good is if it's blocked by its own pawns. So here you say, well, here White's bishop is blocked by its own pawns, but the fact that this pawn is still mobile and still can move forward so easily, it has a huge amount of potential as a result. Plus, I think most strong players would say a bishop that's protecting a valuable pawn is doing important work. And of course, here it is this is an important pawn, as is this. So, but those are sort of some of the general concepts about when one is better than the other. But it's one of the things I think that makes chess such a unique game is that it sometimes seems hard to put your finger on exactly why, if you know what I mean. It's what keeps chess interesting as long as it's been. So.
Thanks so much to both of you, and just a really special look at a really significant game, and appreciate your time and willing to join us here in the Xavier chess class, Core 100, the game of chess. And thanks again, and we will see everyone later.
Thanks.